Hey, I'm Jordan. Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. Today, we're going to look at why angels don't have wings. When I say the word angel, what image comes to mind? Probably something like a Christmas ornament. White robes, golden halo, and most importantly, wings. Big, white, feathery wings stretched wide enough to fill the sky. There's just one problem with that. The Bible never actually says angels have wings. Now, yes, seraphim, cherubim, those throne guardians of Isaiah and Ezekiel, they're winged beings. Seraphim cry, "Holy, holy," with 6 wings, and cherubim stretch out their wings over the ark in the temple. But when it comes to the messengers who appear to Abraham, to Gideon, to Mary, the shepherds in Bethlehem, the ones that we put on our Christmas tree, not a feather in sight. In fact, the book of Hebrews warns that some have entertained angels unaware, meaning they look so ordinary, so human, you wouldn't have known. And the earliest Christian art agrees. In the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome, painted in the 3rd century, Gabriel stands before Mary. No halo, no wings, just a man in a simple robe, hands raised as if mid-conversation. For the early church, angels weren't costumes, they were encounters. And the power wasn't in the feathers, it was in the message. So how did angels grow wings? The leap didn't come overnight. It emerged in the cultural crossroads of the 4th and 5th centuries, when Christianity was no longer a persecuted sect hiding in catacombs, but it was a faith rising into public life, forced to speak the language of Roman art. Imagine walking into a basilica in Ravenna, where the air smells of fresh plaster and beeswax candles, sunlight cutting through, catching flashings of color, and high above, an artisan balances on scaffolding, surrounded by piles of tiny glass and stone tesserae. His task? To do a portrait of Michael the Archangel, heaven's commander. But there's a problem. How do you show the difference between Michael and, say, a Roman general or a court official? A purple robe, a staff, even a crown, these symbols already belong to earthly rulers. So Michael needed something that said, "I'm not from here." And so the artisan, he reached backwards, as we often do, into Rome's cultural memory. He had seen statues of Nike, yeah, that one, the goddess of victory, who stood poised above battlefields, wings unfurled as if frozen mid-flight. Victorious emperors, they loved her image. Nike descended with wreaths, crowning the conqueror. He had also seen Hermes, the messenger god, depicted with winged sandals and a helmet, darting between Olympus and Earth. Wings were a code, and they spoke a visual language every Roman understood: speed, transcendence, and most important, divinity. So the artisan picked up a handful of golden tesserae and pressed them carefully onto Michael's shoulders. Feather by feather, the archangel took flight. When worshippers entered and gazed up, they didn't need an explanation. This figure wasn't a nobleman. This was someone who belonged to another realm, someone who could move freely between heaven and earth. And it worked. Once the idea appeared, it started spreading everywhere in the empire. And by the time Justinian commissioned the mosaics that we see in Ravenna in the 6th century, angels with wings were standard. To see an angel without them almost would have felt incomplete. But notice the irony. The Bible never gave angels wings. Pagan gods did. And in a twist of cultural borrowing, Christianity baptized Rome's imagery and turned it into its own visual shorthand. And once we fastened those wings on, they never came off. But art was only part of the story. While artisans in Ravenna were tilting wings onto angels, far away in the deserts of Egypt and Syria, another transformation was underway. This one wasn't about images, it was about ideas. See, the desert was where theology learned to speak in the language of warfare. Picture a monk in the 4th century, kneeling alone in a cave outside Nitria. The sand is cold at night, the silence is heavy. He prays. And suddenly he feels the onslaught of thoughts, even though he's alone in the desert. He feels lust, anger, pride, despair. And they feel like more than just impulses, like they're attackers. And this was the world of Evagrius Ponticus, one of the earliest desert theologians. He cataloged what he called logismoi, evil thoughts, 8 of them to be precise: gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, sloth, vainglory, and pride. And Evagrius described them like enemy soldiers that were laying siege to the soul. The mind was a battlefield, prayer was the defense, temptation was not abstract, it was personal, targeted, and strategic. And when his writings traveled west, they found a powerful voice in John Cassian. He was a monk who had studied in Egypt before studying to Gaul, and his works, the institutes and the conferences, they were becoming spiritual classics, and they were shaping both Eastern and Western monasticism. Cassian painted temptation as a war of attrition. Demons were not chaotic forces. Rather, they were cunning. He described them almost like military generals. They plotted sieges, exploited weak points, and they adapted strategies to each soul. In Cassian's view, the Christian life, it wasn't a debate over some abstract good and evil. It was a campaign. It was long. It was relentless against intelligent adversaries. Now notice what's missing. Cassian never gave Satan goat legs, horns, or wings. He didn't need to, because he gave the devil something far more frightening, a personality. Not evil as an idea, but evil as an opponent, someone who thought, schemed, and wanted you undone. And his writings, they spread throughout monasteries in Europe. And in doing so, he was preparing the ground. Because when medieval artists and playwrights came along, they gave the devil a costume, horns, hooves, a tail. The theology was already in place. The soil had been tilled. All that was left was to give the adversary a face. And by the 10th to 12th century, wings weren't just painted, they were performed. Europe was alive. It was a new kind of art form, the mystery plays. It was sweeping biblical dramas staged in marketplaces and churchyards. And they began as simple liturgical skits inside cathedrals, but it soon spilled into the streets, and by the late Middle Ages, they had become communal spectacles, sometimes lasting for days. With entire towns, by the late Middle Ages, they had become communal spectacles, sometimes lasting for days, with entire towns contributing carpenters, costumers, musicians, and actors. Imagine a summer festival in England around 1400. The Chester mystery plays are in full swing. The streets reek of roasted meats, horses, and candle smoke as crowds of merchants bump elbows with farmers, and children jostle shoulder to shoulder. Wooden stages creak under the weight of actors, who are dressed as prophets, patriarchs, and apostles. For many in the audience, this will be the only Bible they'll ever see. And then comes the climax. An angel appears. A stagehand hidden in the rafters lowers a trembling actor by ropes, and strapped on his shoulders, as you can imagine, are enormous wings. A little girl tugs at her mom's sleeve.
Is that what angels look like?
This wasn't just entertainment. For a population that couldn't read Latin, the language of Scripture, theater became revelation. And what audience saw wasn't a director's creative flourish. It was to them, this must be heaven breaking to earth. And the wings, they weren't theology, they were just stagecraft. But the stagecraft worked, it burned into memory. And when peasants returned to their fields or merchants to their shops, they carried with them not a doctrine but an image. Angels as radiant wing messengers hovering between worlds. The medieval plays were like the YouTube of their day. They were visual sermons that reached the masses, combining spectacle with devotion. And just like viral images now, once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. And for generations of Europeans, angel wings ceased to be optional. They became scripture itself, lived, breathed, and unforgettable. And of course, angels weren't the only ones that get a makeover. Stage directions from the Chester plays, they describe a foul devil in horrible array, wielding a fork. Costumes featured horns, tails, grotesque masks, claws. The devil was a menace, and honestly, comic relief as well. His pitchfork, likely borrowed from Neptune's trident, it became a permanent prop. Audiences adored it. They laughed as much as they feared, and evil was no longer a concept, it was embodied. And angels needed wings to balance the drama. By the High Middle Ages, art was no longer simply decoration. It was catechism in stone and paint. And it confirmed what the theater had popularized. Angels had wings, and the devil had a face. Step inside a cathedral in the early 12th century, and you might find the sculptor Giliberto carving the Last Judgment over the portal in haunting detail. On one side, Christ enthroned in majesty. On the other, a horned Satan weighing human souls like a butcher with a scale. And to a peasant entering for Mass, this was not a metaphor. It was a carved sermon in limestone. It was meant to both terrify and teach. 2 centuries later, in the 1440s, the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, for wealthy Dutch noblewomen, depicted hell as a roaring furnace. Demons in black and red stoked the flames, tormented the damned. Even in private devotion, the images reinforced the script. Devils, grotesque, angels, up high, radiant. And then came Hieronymus Bosch. In works like The Last Judgment and The Garden of Earthly Delights, he filled panels with horned, grotesque, fish-headed monsters and winged hybrids that defy reason. His art was not meant to be naturalistic, but nightmarish, a surreal vision of evil so strange it was unsettling to modern eyes. And he didn't invent those horns and wings, but he baptized them into the cultural imagination forever. And if the mystery plays taught villagers what angels and demons looked like, the walls of churches and the pages of manuscripts hammered it in again and again. You couldn't escape the imagery. Whether in the vaulted shadow of a cathedral or the intimate pages of a prayer book, the same visual catechism was preached. Angels, winged messengers, devils, horned deceivers. And by the Renaissance, this identity was fixed. When the Reformation erupted in the 16th century, Protestants weaponized the imagery in pamphlets. Catholics were characterized as literal agents of Satan, monks drawn with horns and tails. An interesting twist, the Protestants kept the winged angels too. The icons crossed confessional lines. The devil and the angel with wings were now cultural currency. You didn't need a Bible verse, you only needed that image, one glance, and the meaning was understood. And in Florence in 1489, a wealthy patron kneels in hushed anticipation. Before him, Botticelli unveils a new altarpiece. Golden winged angels arc across the canvas, their feathers layered with the artist's finest gold leaf. The light catches and dances across the sanctuary like fire. These angels were not merely decorative. They're radiant, towering, otherworldly, living bridges between heaven and earth. The patron, he weeps. Not because he believes angels literally bear wings, but because the wings are beautiful, transcendent. They mean heaven is not far off. And in a world where plague, war, and famine haunted every household, rich or poor, this painting whispered a deeper truth. God's presence surrounds us still. Fast forward 4 centuries, a very different scene. In a modest German parlor of the 19th century, the glow of a wood stove flickers against plaster walls. Above the mantel hangs a popular lithograph, mass-produced and sold in towns across Europe. A guardian angel, vast wings arch, guiding 2 children across a rickety bridge. It's sentimental but also tender, and for this family, perhaps still mourning a child lost in infancy, the wings were not doctrine. They were solace, a visual promise whispered in feathered form. You are not alone. And in both the Renaissance chapel and the middle-class parlor, wings carried weight. They transcended the literal to touch the emotional and gave the invisible a shape that people could hold on to. Art had made theology domestic. And the same wings that once glowed over altarpieces in Florence now hung quietly in everyday homes, folded into the fabric of ordinary faith. Fast forward to 1946. Some of you already know where we're going. It's a Wonderful Life. Clarence finally earns his wings. The audience chuckles and smiles and maybe a tear, but the idea, it's sealed. Angels don't just sometimes have wings. Wings are their defining feature. They're what matters. And even when played for laughs, the image is hardened into cultural memory. So why does all this matter? Because when we fixate on feathers, we risk missing the shock of the biblical witness. Angels aren't gentle guardians in soft-focus paintings. They're terrifying, glorious agents of God's will. They move at the speed of obedience. They speak, and worlds tremble. Hebrews calls them ministering spirits. Paul names them powers and principalities. Revelation shows them wielding trumpets and bowls of judgment. Wings are poetic, but the reality is stranger and far more thrilling. So next time you see a Christmas card angel, pause. Picture the artisan in Ravenna, tilling feathers onto Michael's back. The medieval crowd gasping as a feathered actor is swung from the rafters, and the Victorian family sighing at the guardian angel lithograph. And then remember, the Bible never says they had wings. The early church didn't care what angels looked like. They cared what angels did. They were messengers of the Most High, warriors of unseen realms, spirits blazing with obedience. Feathers are not. Angels do remind us. Heaven is nearer than we think.